Welcome back to Today We Wrench. Today we're going to go from our torn apart engine to a fully rebuilt brand new engine. Let's do it. Alright, so I have all my bolts and hardware wire wheeled. I've sent out this case to my powder coater so that he could bead blast it, and I have already chased out these threads. Again, it's highly advised that you wire wheel all your bolts and chase out your threads before assembly. So now that we've done all that, let's get to assembly. If you've opted to have your cases bead blasted, make sure they do not get the mating surface. It's going to get some overshoot on it to where it'll dull the mating surface, but just make sure they don't bead blast the mating surface. So when it comes back from sandblasting, you're going to use a gasket preparation tool, and this is like 2,000 grit little fingers, and you're just going to run over the mating surface so that it's nice and smooth again, but don't use hard pressure, just nice and light, fast, quick hand movements. You're not trying to grind out any metal, you're just trying to clean it up. Next, we're going to reinstall our rotary shaft bearing, and for what I do for these is I put these in the freezer so it shrinks up, and then we're just going to slide it in with our fingers, push it in as much as we can, make sure it's flat, and then we're going to use a 20 mil socket, and we're just going to real lightly tap this in. Now that your bearing's seated in, you're going to freeze this rotary shaft because the metal will contract on you. So once your bearings in, you should be able to lightly push it in as much as possible, and then you're going to wait for this to thaw and become room temperature again and kind of tap it in with a rubber mallet. Once this is seated, you're going to put your retaining ring back in. So next we're going to seal up our mating surfaces, and we're going to be using Loctite 518, which is the replacement for 515, which is what SeaDoo used from the manufacturer. So we're going to go along all of our mating surfaces, both sides, a nice small even bead, because we're going to kind of skim across it with our finger to flatten it out. And the most important thing is that when you put your gasket maker in, you're going to do inside of these chamfers for your rotary gear seals. So make sure that you put in 518 where the rotary seals are going to sit, so it's nice and sealed up, because most of the time when you have a crank that's leaking, it's because those seals are spinning in place, and the seals themselves actually aren't bad. When we go to set the crank in, the bearings have little tiny dowels in them, and your case is cut for reliefs for the dowels, which if you're looking at it from the back side of it where your PTO is, it'll be to the left. So we're going to drop the crank in, set it where it needs to be set without letting it fall completely into place, and we're going to rotate the bearings so that they are against the mating surface. And once that's all rotated, we can set it down. Along with doing 518 inside of your seals, you're also going to do it on the rotary shaft where the seals meet the case. And I just put a little bead and I'll roll it in with my finger. Again, this whole thing is just a real light coat of this gasket sealer. You do not need it to apply it very heavy. So just nice and light before you install. All right, so now that our gasket maker's all on it, our crank's set in, we're going to put our counterbalance shaft in. So on our counterbalance shaft, this is going to be your indicator. That's your timing mark. So on this tooth is going to be your timing mark. So there's also a timing mark that's either going to be laser and etched, which we're using a WSM crank and they kind of laser etch it. There's going to be a timing mark here. So what I do is I start it first by putting this timing mark like lining up, and I'll rotate my assembly so that it just kind of drops in. And now that it's dropped in, everything's pushed down. We're making sure that our seals are not walking back towards the engine. They're setting back where they're supposed to be. Now we're going to go back in front of this and we're going to rotate our assembly to make sure that these marks line up, and they do. Your assembly's in, you're verified that your seals are in the correct spots. You're just going to lightly turn it over to make sure nothing's binding. All your bearings are moving freely, nothing's scraping inside of your case. Once you verified that, we will start putting in the seals. I've already cleaned this with a little bit of acetone or degreaser just to kind of get your grease off of it. I'm going to put a little bit of 518 on it. I'm going to spread it all the way around, and then I'm going to insert it after that. So next we're going to do our crankshaft seals. So I always get OEM seals. There's the part number if you want to pause it so you can order it. This is the OEM seal. I'm going to use the residual 518 that I have on from our cap, and I'm just going to apply it to the seal. Okay, so now you have 518 on that. We're going to set that in place. And then I buy new shims. You don't have to, you can reuse your new shim, but since I'm restoring skis, I buy new ones. So if you want to buy a new one, there's your part number. So you're going to put the shim into its spot. You're going to move your seal against that. Alright, so now we're going to put our top of our case on, now that we've verified everything's in its correct spot. So we're going to kind of hold it in between the cylinders, kind of guide our connecting rods through it, make sure everything's lining up. Don't force this, it should just drop into place. And once it's dropped into place, we're going to flip it over and start our torque sequence. So now that our case is mated together, we flip it upside down and we're going to start installing our wire wheeled bolts. So we'll go over torque specs. I'll put a screenshot of the sequence so you can pause it. When installing the crankcase bolts, you're going to go according to the manual, and the manual calls for a little bit of 518 on these threads. So you're just going to do a nice bead down the center of it, and then you're going to torque them all to spec. Now it's all together, you're going to get some of this squeeze out. So for that, I just take a little bit of acetone, very lightly, and we'll just we'll wipe the whole thing clean. Because this will not look great if painted. You can also, you don't have to be super particular about getting it off. Once the engine's all together, you can spray it down with carb clean, just to kind of get your greasy fingers and everything off. But since you're going to be working on it now, you want to wipe all this clean because you'll start tracking it through the whole engine as you're working on it. So next we're going to do our flywheel housing assembly. We're going to put a new gasket, or seal I should say, in the back of this. Here's your part number if you want to get OEM. Again, OSD Marine has all this. So it's going to go in from the back side. Here's our new one. And we're going to put 518 around this again and press it in. Make sure you do not press hard on this, because if you damage this, it will lead to ingestion of air to the crank. So you shouldn't have to use any tools really, just firm push, working your way around so it walks itself down. And once it's mated flat, you're going to flip it over. And if you can see right there, it's not set up against the housing, so it needs to go in a little bit more. So let's get this set in and then we'll install it. Alright, so now we're going to prepare this surface for installing our housing. We're going to use 518, a real light coat, just like we did in the rest of this engine, and then we'll put our gasket on as well. We're just doing both sides. Again, a real light coat. It's probably redundant, but I've rebuilt a lot of engines and this is the way I always do it. So smear it in your finger like we did in the whole thing. Just a real nice skim coat. And then we'll torque it all down. Now that our case is mated together, we're going to pre-lubricate our counterbalance assembly. And for this, we are going to install 40 milliliters or 1 ounce of two-stroke oil, because that's what's going to be running through this engine anyways. So you're going to insert it into this pre-fill hole. Now this is a 1998 case, so if you have a 1995, 96, or early model 97, 787 case, it will not have this filler hole. So for that, it's important that you do not install your cylinders until you use a syringe like this, and you're going to fill it through this oil drain back hole that is found towards the back of the engine. So this is where your PTO is. Here's the oil drain back hole. It goes directly in to this counterbalance assembly. So again, install 40 milliliters or 1 ounce. So now we're gonna start assembling the top end. So we have our piston, and in your piston box will come 2 rings. One will be perfectly flat, one will have a bevel. So let's put the flat one on first. That's our lower ring, and it'll have these guide pins. So we're gonna start out, we're just gonna kind of walk it down so we don't break it. Okay. Then we're gonna take the top ring, and with the beveled end up, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to find our centering, and we're just going to walk it around until it snaps into place. So now that we have our rings on, we're going to insert one of our C-clips into the piston just to make it a little bit easier on us. So when you do this, the open side is supposed to be facing up. It's not supposed to be anywhere near this slot. So insert that first one and make sure that it doesn't land like this and lands more like this. So before we install one of our pistons, we're going to put our bearing cages into the actual connecting rod, and I always just put a little bit of assembly lube on that so that it has something to start out its first couple cycles with. It's sticky, so we'll put this in, and I kind of rotate it just to get it nice and lubed up. I'll rotate the crank, and then I will take, on your pistons, there's going to be arrows, and you want to face the arrow towards the exhaust side. So the arrow is going to be facing your rotary valve plate. So it'll be installed just like this, with the arrow facing your rotary plate. So before I put my actual piston on my crankshaft, I'll put my wrist pin in, and I'll get it so that it's just flush with the inside, so that when I set it in, I can kind of center it with my finger and just kind of rotate and wiggle it on. These should not have to be hammered in, forced in. They should slide right in just like you saw. If it's not, something's wrong. Reassess what's going on, but do not hammer it in. All right, so I'll show you how I install all my C-clips. So again, like I said earlier, you want the relief facing up. So what I do is I'll put it lightly in the relief groove, and I'll just kind of work my way with pushing my thumb. I'll work my way around it, and I'll push in with my thumb at the same time. And then when this is hanging out like this, you don't want to keep bending it because you'll loosen the tension on this. So you just want to walk it in, and then once it's in, just make sure it's all the way around the groove. And once it is, then you're good to go. Our pistons are in. Once again, pay attention, make sure that the arrows, both arrows, are facing towards the rotary side, and we're going to install a cylinder. Alright, so now that we're at the installation of the cylinder part, we're going to line up our dowels, compress our pistons, and we are going to set our cylinder on. Alright, so now that our cylinders are installed, we're going to install all of our bolts that we've wire wheeled. We're going to do the same thing with our 518 on all of our bolts, and then we're going to torque them down to spec, which we will put on the screen now. Now that our cylinders are all torqued down, we're going to clean out where all of our O-rings go, and then we're going to install our O-rings. So when I put these in, I put a little bit of 518 in these grooves, and whatever squishes out, I kind of just run my finger around the whole thing to spread it evenly. So now that you've installed that, you're going to install the water jug seals. They just kind of work them back and forth. They set in. The head will squish down the rest of it. So now that they're all set in, now it's time to install the head. So when you're torquing down the head, there is a pattern. We'll display a picture for you, but follow the torque sequence on it and then torque them all down. We'll also put the torque setting in the video here. Now that our cylinders are on, we can put our flywheel on. We're going to look for our woodruff key slot, and we're going to make sure that it lines up perfectly with the woodruff key. This should just slide right on. It should have not a lot of pressure for it to go in. So once it's on, rotate it a couple times, make sure it's good, and then you're ready to set your nut on. So you need a little bit of Loctite on this, and this 518 is fine for it. Just don't put it on without it. For torquing this down, you're going to take a rag and you're going to put it inside of the cylinder so that, make sure it's all, not completely in, but make sure it's center so that it's not coming up on the edges of your piston. So I have a little bit sticking out so you can pull it out later, but this is going to make it so when you rotate the engine assembly over, it has something to stop the engine again so that you can torque this flywheel nut down properly. Before we put the flywheel cover back on it, because I'm not going to put this PTO on before paint, I'm going to rotate this with a flathead screwdriver inside the front of the cylinder, and I'm going to rotate it until that screwdriver is at its highest point. So you can see when I rotate it, it goes up and down. So find that highest point, right, so it's starting to go down, so I'm going to go right back up to the center of that, and that's going to be my top dead center. So once we have our top dead center, we can set our timing. We're going to take our degree wheel, and we're going to take it where it says 360, and we're going to put 360 at the bottom of this port opening, and we're going to want to do 147 degrees. So here's 140, 145, 6, 7, and we're just going to put a small hash mark in there so we see where it's at. All right, so now we're going to take our rotary wheel and we're going to install it. So there's two ways that this is going to go on. So you're going to find out where it's at and see how it's backed off that 147 mark. We're going to flip it over. And once it's flipped over, it lines up perfectly. So now that we've have our rotary plate on, we're going to recheck top dead center. So we're going to kind of rotate it. So now it's going to start going down and right where it goes up. Okay, so that's determined to be our highest point. So now we're going to recheck with our degree wheel on. We're going to find 360 again. We're going to put it at the bottom of the port, and we're going to look for 45, 7. So that's perfectly timed. So now that our wheel's on, we're gonna make sure we have our gasket in the back of this plate. We're gonna set our plate on and bolt it down. Your nuts all torqued down. You can wipe off your excess 518 that squirted out, and you're gonna put your oil pump shaft back on. So don't forget your gasket that goes inside of this whole thing. Once that gasket's in, you're good to set it in place. And just follow these dowels, push it in, and install your bolts. Now that your engine is assembled, I usually wait a day for the 518 to fully cure. Once it's cured, you're gonna hook up a pressure tester, and you're gonna pressure test the rotary seal. So you're gonna hook up one line to the oil intake, and you're gonna hook up one line to the oil return, and you're going to slowly pressurize your rotary seal until you see 8 pounds. And once you see 8 pounds, stop, because if you go over 8 pounds or if you go over 10 pounds, it's too much pressure for the rotary seal and it could blow out. So you're gonna leave this at 8 pounds and you're gonna let it pressure test. I usually leave it overnight to see how much it drops, but theoretically, you know, some people recommend 2 hours. So at least 2 hours, it should hold 8 pounds of pressure. Once that's passed, then you have a fully seated rotary seal. All right, so now that our rotary seal has been pressure tested and passed, we're gonna install the exhaust along with these block-off plates so that I can pressure test the entire engine. And the purpose of that is to make sure that my crankshaft seals are fully seated and everything else in the engine is airtight, to make sure that when it's running, it's not pulling in air and creating a lean condition. So I'm going to install these and then we'll show you how to pressure test it. Now that we have all of our plates on, we're going to pressure test the entire engine, and we're going to do the same procedure. We're going to fill it up to 8 pounds, and we're going to leave it sit for at least 2 hours. I leave it overnight. Once that passes the test, you're ready for paint. That's it for the engine rebuild video. As far as paint, since I have everything blasted, I take it to my buddy's spray booth, and I use a 2-part PPG paint. I use base and a clear coat, like automotive finish, but you can use whatever you want as long as you're using some type of self-etching primer and a heat-resistant paint. So on the next episode, we're going to be rebuilding these carbs and these rave valves so that we're one step closer to getting this thing in the water. Thanks for tuning in.